With question 15 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia, St. Thomas Aquinas is going to turn his attention now to consent. And as if you've been watching these videos the last few days, you know that he's really dissecting human actions, because we think of a human action as just being something that, well, it's a human action. It's either right or it's wrong. But Thomas is not content with that simple of an explanation of human action. He wants to know all the parts of it, like the intention and the choice and the counsel and now consent. And tomorrow will be use. And of course, we talked about circumstances and objects of actions. And it's really fascinating to see how specific he's getting down into the nitty-gritty of what makes a human action an action, and also how each part of the human act is related to the intellect and the will, and whether it's proper to human beings or is this something that irrational animals would have as well. And so these are the kind of questions that are very much on St. Thomas Aquinas' mind as he goes into this. And, we've heard of the word consent. We use it often. Somebody consents to something, and that means they've agreed to do it, or there might have been some, twisting of the arm, and then finally they consent to it. It's an important word, but the explanation that Thomas gives is really fascinating, as you'll find in these next four articles. The first one says whether consent is an act of the appetitive or of the apprehensive power. Appetitive, of course, has to do with desires. This would be sensitive appetites, and also the will is an appetite. It's an intellectual appetite. Apprehensive means knowledge. It's associated with the intellect. When we apprehend something, we come to know it. So Aquinas says consent implies application of sense to something. S-E-N-S-E. Have you ever thought of that? That to consent is an application of sense? I would think that it would be more intellectual, but that's not where Thomas is going to go with this. He says, now it is proper to sense, to take cognizance of things present, for the imagination apprehends the similitude of corporeal things. All right, so our senses are associated with corporeal things, where our senses cannot see or taste something that's invisible, right? Oh, I guess you could smell something invisible, but you can't see something invisible. So really, these are corporeal things, even in the absence of the things of which they bear the likeness, while the intellect apprehends universal ideas. Okay, so here, again, if you've been watching these videos, he's very much interested in the universal versus the particular, and our senses always are associated with particular things. Our intellects are associated with universals. Okay, we abstract universals from the particular things. Okay, so the intellect apprehends universal ideas, which it can apprehend indifferently, whether the singulars be present or absent. And since the act of an appetitive power is a kind of inclination to the thing itself, the application of the appetitive power to the thing, insofar as it cleaves to it, gets by a kind of similitude the name of sense, since as it were it acquires direct knowledge of the thing to which it cleaves, insofar as it takes complacency in it. Hence it is written, think of the Lord in goodness. And on these grounds, consent is an act of the appetitive power. So what Thomas is establishing here is that, every one of these actions has more to do either with the intellect or the will. Okay, so this, or the sensitive desire for that matter. So he's saying this is not primarily having to do with apprehension or the acquisition of knowledge. This has to do with an appetite. This has to do with the more of the appetitive, aspect of the human soul, as he has explained. All right, so now he's very much interested. Okay, is this proper to a human being, or would consent also be found in irrational animals? Now you might say, well, since it has to do with the senses, as he said in the last article, it probably is something that the animals can do, because the animals, like us, have the senses. But no, that's not where he's going to go with this. He says consent, properly speaking, is not in irrational animals. The reason of this is that consent implies an application of the appetitive movement to something as to be done. Now, to apply the appetitive movement to the doing of something belongs to the subject in whose power it is to move the appetite. Thus, and then he gives an example here, which I find interesting. To touch a stone is an action suitable to a stick, but to apply the stick so that it touch the stone belongs to one who has the power to move the stick. So what he's getting at here is that the animals can sense, but they are not moving themselves. The animals are being moved by something else like God, and they're not making any decisions. And so therefore, even though they have senses, they're not applying the senses to actions. They don't have intellects. They're not able to do that. They don't have free will either. But irrational animals have not the command of the appetitive movement, for this is in them through natural instinct. Hence, in the irrational animal, there is indeed the movement of the appetite, but it does not apply that movement to some particular thing. And hence it is that the irrational animal is not properly said to consent. This is proper to the rational nature, which has the command of the appetitive movement. So we have senses, we have appetites, but we're able to control them to some degree, and we're able to command and kind of point them in one direction or the other. But Thomas is saying with the irrational animals, it's all just instinct, and so they really don't have any way of consenting in that regard. Article 3 says whether consent is directed to the end or to the means. Now, he's very concerned about this because, as I've said in the last few days, we're directed to an end, but through means. And so we have all these different means that are ultimately getting us to an end. He says consent is the application of the appetitive movement to something that is already in the power of him who causes the application. All right, so this is the rational creature, right? Now, the order of action is this. Now, I love what he does here because he's gonna really highlight all the different aspects that go into an action. He says, first, there is the apprehension of the end. Okay, first we understand what it is that is the object of the action, right? That's the apprehension. That has to do with the knowledge. Then the desire of the end. Okay, so I come to know of a banana split, right? That's knowledge. I know it. Then I desire it with a sensitive appetite or a will, which is an intellectual appetite, right? And then I counsel about the means. Okay, so I take counsel. We've already gone over all these, right? Then the desire of the means. Now the appetite tends to the last end naturally, wherefore the application of the appetitive movement to the apprehended end has not the nature of consent, but of simple volition. But to those things which come under consideration after the last end, insofar as they are directed to the end, they come under counsel, which we have already learned about. And so counsel can be applied to them insofar as the appetitive movement is applied to the judgment resulting from counsel, but the appetitive movement to the end is not applied to counsel, rather is counsel applied to it because counsel presupposes the desire of the end. All right, so we already learned that counsel has to do with the means, choice has to do with the means, and now we're learning that consent is also going to have to do with the means as well because it's related to those other things. Counsel presupposes the desire of the end. On the other hand, the desire of the means presupposes the decision of counsel. And therefore, the application of the appetitive movement to counsel's decision is consent, properly speaking. Consequently, since counsel is only about the means, consent, properly speaking, is nothing else but about the means. So counsel and consent are going together, all right? Once you counsel and then you consent to something, but it is the means and not the end. All right, whether consent is to the act belongs only to the higher part of the soul. Now, here's a depiction of a soul. You can't really see a soul because it's invisible, but there are different parts of the soul. You have the rational part, you have the sensitive part, you have, the passions. All these are part of the soul, but the intellectual part is the highest. He says the final decision belongs to him who holds the highest place, and to whom it belongs to judge of the others. For as long as judgment about some matter remains to be pronounced, the final decision has not been given. Now it is evident that it belongs to the higher reason to judge of all, since it is by the reason that we judge of sensible things. And of things pertaining to human principles, we judge according to divine principles, which is the function of the higher reason. Wherefore, as long as a man is uncertain whether he resists or not according to divine principles, no judgment of reason can be considered in the light of a final decision. Now, the final decision of what is to be done is consent to the act. Therefore, consent to the act belongs to the higher reason, but in that sense in which the reason includes the will, as stated above. So, what do you need to know out of this article? That consent has to do with the higher region of the intellect or the will and not the lower part, right? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. We will continue with the dissection of the human action tomorrow as we get into use, and then a little bit more about the will and specific parts of decision making. So again, this is very practical, this is very important, and it ties in so beautifully to the overall structure of the Summa Theologia. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll join me in the days to come. God bless you, St. Thomas Aquinas. Pray for us.